Hey, this is Annie.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff Mom Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio.
And today we are so excited to be joined by filmmaker, activist, creator, teacher, Gajajuni Fox. I got really nervous there. And I'm so sorry. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here with you guys visiting this morning.
And I'm not going to lie, I am so excited that you're on the show. I kind of already have fangirled a little bit too much, I know, at the beginning. But yeah, we are so excited because just after watching your short film, which is what we're going to talk about in just a minute, it was amazing. Like some of the things that it unpacked and really opened up the reality of our history or the history of the U.S. and really having a moment to talk about the truth when it comes to whitewashing of what even was what we would consider something to celebrate. And yes, I'm already getting way too deep into this. And honestly, as we were looking at having this conversation and watching your short film, it honestly was one of those, why haven't we had you on the show sooner? You've been doing this work and you've been doing some amazing things with your company, with your production company. And I'm like, holy crap, Annie, why hasn't she been on this show? So first and foremost, I'm so sad that we haven't, but I'm so glad to be a part to have you on the show. So again, as I'm fangirling, and I do this a lot, thank you so much for coming on. And I'm done. I'm going to stop because I'm blushing now because I'm so excited. I know I'm not going to stop, you're right. But before we get into all of that, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience and our listeners and tell a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. So Sego, hello. My name is Gajajuni, which means I make flowers. I am from the community of Akwesasne, which is Mohawk Nation territory right on the St. Lawrence River, U.S.-Canada border, kind of crossed through our territories a while back. And I am a filmmaker. I'm also a visual artist and was an educator for over 20 years and just recently left that to just pursue filmmaking. And that's why I can sit with you here this morning. I'm not teaching.
We're so glad.
Yeah.
Could you tell us how did you get into filmmaking? What made you pursue that path?
I think as a visual artist, I like to try everything. So that was one of the things I was just experimenting with. And really, I got into it as a teacher. So I was teaching at one time at the Akwesasne Freedom School, which is a Mohawk immersion school where my own children went here in our community of Akwesasne. So there they teach everything in our language, in the Mohawk language. And I was teaching some media classes there. So we were doing like clay animations and, making little short films and stuff like that. And then I started teaching at our local high school here at Salmon River, and I taught a film class there for many years and just doing a lot of like little film projects just in our community. And then I got into making documentaries, and my first documentary came out in 2016, which was Ohilogo Under the Husk, following my daughter and her best friend going through their fourth year of their rites of passage. And it was something that we were able to recover and bring back to our community that had been dormant for many generations. So I thought it was really important to document that. So that's kind of been my path as a filmmaker.
Yeah, and something you talked about in some of your interviews, and obviously the themes of your documentary, is just empowering women and empowering young girls, especially of the Native community, and really understanding who they are. And that seems to be a big part of your Native community as well, which I find so amazing and empowering just from sitting here. Why do you think messages like that are so important?
I think it's important to do this kind of work because Indigenous people are very invisible in the media. You see Black people, you see white people, you see Asian people, but you rarely see Indigenous people on media, in any kind of media. And then to take that even farther, as a teacher for so many years, I taught Native studies and I taught Native film and I also taught language and arts. It was hard to find resources that we were in. And then even when we found resources, a lot of times they weren't accurate because they weren't told from our perspective. that's why I think it's so important that we have Indigenous storytellers, we have Indigenous filmmakers that are sharing things from our own perspective, like doing the inside job of telling a story and understanding, really understanding the nuances and understanding the culture and the community. And, those are the kind of stories I like to tell. I like to tell it from the inside.
Right. As it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it's beautifully said, because you talk a lot about in your films about having a voice. And making sure that the voice was represented. And I think you did such an amazing job with this film, Without a Whisper. Can you talk a little bit about this film?
Sure. So this film, I started thinking about it right after I had finished making Under the Husk. I was actually at a film festival and somebody asked, "What's your next project?" And I was like, well, I've always wanted to do this film to tell the story of how the Haudenosaunee women influenced the women's rights movement. Because I think for me, it was something that even our own people didn't really know about. I had learned about it at a history conference probably about 15 years ago. Sally Roche Wagner, who's in the film, came to present to the history teachers at this conference. And I was like, what? Our women influenced the women's rights movement? I mean, I had never even, hadn't heard about it. And I thought, our people should know that. And it's something that the world should know. So I started to pursue that, and I had the perfect people to tell that story. I had Sally Roche Wagner, and then I had our clan mother from our community, Louise Hearn, who are already good friends. So it made sense to kind of reflect that history and their friendship, and to tell that story through them.
It was so beautiful. I loved every moment of them just loving each other and praising each other's work. I really had a moment of like, yeah, they understand each other. This is what friendship and allyship really looks like, that like there's no pomp or, any of those circumstances of like trying to one-up each other or trying to outdo each other. It was really elevating each other's voices. It was so beautiful to see. And I love how you were able to capture all those intimate friendship moments.
Yeah, I think it's for me, they're both really good friends of mine. So a lot of times they don't pay attention to us in the room when they're doing things. And yeah, I think that's a good thing. And they're both, especially Louise, you never know what's going to come out of her mouth.
She's a powerhouse, I will say. Like, she
totally
commands a room.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about just the process of filming this movie?
Well, I followed them around for, I think, 2 years filming this. And I kind of had an idea of some of the things that the messages I wanted to come out in the film. Of course, the story of, the relationship of the Indigenous women and the suffragettes that were, living in Haudenosaunee territory, and seeing, our women and, the status that we had in our communities. So I really wanted to share that story, and how much Haudenosaunee people have really influenced not just the women's rights movement, but also, the whole government system of the United States is built on our system. So democracy comes from Haudenosaunee people, and it was adopted by the founding fathers, and that's another hidden history that not everybody knows that. So always, as a filmmaker, I'm always trying to, while I'm telling the story, I feel like I have to educate people, because they've only been told a one-sided story. They've only been told, one perspective of history. So I always have to be mindful of that as I'm creating.
Right. Honestly, again, when we were talking about your work and researching and wanting to have you on the show, I honestly had this a moment of like, of course, the women's rights movement, of course, the foundation of where we stand and our rights, as well as our government, was influenced, if not stolen, honestly, from the Indigenous people who were here before. And not only that, Indigenous women who knew how to lead and to care for their family. It was almost like, it should have been assumed, like when you actually said that, like, this makes perfect sense. And why haven't we been talking about it more?
Yeah. Well, I think there's reasons why we don't talk about it,
Right. I mean, and that's part of the problem, because even today, as we go through so much conversation. And again, like this was such a bright light to what feels like so much darkness in the U.S. history right now, especially when it comes to women's rights, especially when it comes to Indigenous rights. The ICWA, that's coming in front of the Supreme Court. And that's a whole other conversation we've been having outside of that. But we see how when we ignore history / when we actually try to rewrite history and whitewash history, these types of complete downfalls and decimation of people and a community happens. And it's such an odd timing. I don't know. Maybe it's always this way. I'm getting too deep, I know, but that just feels like we're watching, as you have done such an amazing job in bringing to light some history that should have been talked about from the beginning, to watching people try to cover up history once again, and how important it is that we have people from the communities, the Native people, to be able to actually get credit for their work, not just shy, to be able to be the ones to say, yeah, we did this, you're welcome, and why are you trying to hide it again?
Yeah, it's like trying to invisibilize a whole people. And it's ironic, really, when you think about it, because Indigenous people are the first people of Turtle Island, right?
Right.
And their stories are always being hidden, like there was nobody here is kind of, the message that children are getting in schools these days. This is America, and
right.
Everybody's, they hide all the history of the Indigenous people. And going back to what you were talking about before, about democracy and the governmental system, was something that was adopted by the founding fathers, when they were creating the United States Constitution and the government system. And the one thing that they really left out in that was the women.
Right.
So they picked up the balance of power, how things work, when we pass our laws is similar to how it works in, with the United States Senate and Congress and the president. You have the checks and balances, but they totally left out the women. They couldn't handle it. Because their perception of women that they were bringing over from Europe was totally different than, the perception of the Indigenous people here on Turtle Island, because the women are central to everything.
Right. Well, as the clan mother said at the beginning, women are the law. And I love that statement. I was like, that's right. That did make me go, yeah, damn right.
Yeah. And for me, it's more about, like, for the women, our women, you could say the word power, the women had power, but really it was the women had responsibility. Mm-hmm. So our women were the ones that were raising all these leaders. So that's why it was the women that were choosing the chiefs, because they were watching those young ones as they were growing up, and they were seeing, the qualities that they had. Are they generous? Are they thinking for the people, or are they thinking for themselves? Do they have foresight for the future generations? All of those things, they're watching those young people as they were raising them themselves. So it made sense that it was the clan mothers that chose the chiefs, because they were the ones that raised them, and they were the ones that, understood the qualities that they had. Because our leadership, when they are raised up as chiefs, they're in there for life. So my own father is a condoled chief. And it's something, they seen those qualities in him, and he was, raised up as a chief. And it's not a paid position like the president or like the tribal chiefs or elective system. It's something that they do for the love of the people, because it's very hard work to do that. Those are all big responsibilities. It's not a popularity contest. It's not, they're not vested in other people's interests. They're vested in the interest of our, the people today and the future generations. And it'd be great if we had more leaders like that.
Right. That actually represented the people. Mm-hmm. That would be lovely to see. As we talk about all of the things within the film and the fact that, yes, they came together, it was an interesting history, especially as they were talking. You were showing, I always forget I'm talking to you, and I'm like, you're the one who created this. It's like, yes, I don't have to re-explain. Sorry, again, fangirling. But the animation you had of talking about the creation of man, the pictures that you put in to show the historical context of what the conversations were about, it was really amazing to see. It really pulled out a lot of background information. Do you think interweaving styles like that to documentary is important?
I think I had to do it because I kind of had to reimagine what it was like for my ancestors when we were still living in longhouses and villages, and there's no documentation of that.
Right.
So I had to reimagine that, and I was fortunate to work with Marion Delaron from Ganawage, who is another Mohawk creative, and she's an animator from there, and Alex Boya. So the two of them worked together to create all of the animations that were in the film, and I thought it was very important to include creation, because I think that's where all of that comes from. So for us, we came from, our story starts with a woman. So it was Sky Woman that came here and, created the Turtle Island, and then had twins, and they created, the different things on the earth. So everything kind of centers around a woman. But from a Christian point of view, and I show that in the animation, it starts with Adam, and then the woman is created from his rib. She's kind of a secondary character, and then she does something terrible. She does something sinful, and then has to suffer forever because of that. And then, it's just totally different. And I wanted to show that's where those concepts come from, those ideas about women.
And it was such an amazing, integral part to the story and the history of why women are important parts of the community, which is so often, yes, in the Eurocentric ideas left out, which is sad in itself. Don't mind me, I'm a little jaded.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of women as secondary characters is ridiculous.
Right.
When you think about, the gifts that women have to be able to bring life is so important. It's not a secondary thing to be able to do that.
Right. Like literally carrying a child. Like I think it's such an amazing conversation, and that the story within your community talking about the woman being here and creating life. And it's just such a beautiful opening to why the matriarch is so important and why it should be respected and as seen as wisdom along the lines of a community. And I think as we were talking about some of the themes of the documentary, of course, there's tons of themes, as we had already talked about, voices and empowerment of women, and the allyship and friendship. But the fact that they are able to have this conversation about the breakdown of how, again, the Eurocentric ideas really try to cover all of that up. And I know it was just a blip, because this whole film celebrates the culture, and I love that. But you can't ignore the fact that, yes, the whitewashing really decimated the history and tried to hide and or erase all of this from being told to begin with, and why it is so important that we keep bringing it up. And you said you had a whole plan in how you were going to release this film. Why do you think that timing was important?
Well, I wanted to release it in 2020 because that's the 100th year anniversary of women's suffrage. So we timed it to come out at that time. And also Sally was doing a lot of work, and still is doing a lot of work on covering this story. And she's been talking to, the Washington Post, and, she has a lot of media attention on that. And my hope with this film is it'd be part of a movement to really change the narrative on this story for the future generations, so that this story is included in that history. I think that's so important, especially for our young people in our community to know, their own history and their own contributions to the world. And they're not celebrated enough. And, they take history classes here, and then they tiny bit of information that they'll get about us when they're telling history of this continent.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really stuck out to me was I loved seeing all these generations of women. First of all, that was amazing. But also just this this richness of history that has been lost or purposefully left out. And there's a distinction in the documentary of between who's telling the story versus what actually happened in the reality. And I know in one of your interviews, you said, like, this should be in every classroom, like every age. And I totally agree, because it was so powerful. And it was one of those things. And we talk about this a lot on this show, where it's so frustrating that it's like so late in the game. Like, even you, so late in the game, you learn about this. And it's such like a powerful history. And it's where, as you make the point, like, suffragettes were looking at Indigenous women, and like they had to get that idea from somewhere. And so it's like one of those things where I'm like so frustrated that it's like this late that we're having this conversation. But I'm so glad that we're having it, and that, I mean, the documentary is so moving and powerful and beautiful. And I'm so glad that you made it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think people really take that for granted today. You know, we're in 2022 and everybody thinks, oh, women have all the rights they want and whatever. But just like 100 years ago, women had no rights.
Right. Right.
Well, I should say European women had no rights, or people that came from other countries coming here had no rights, because they brought that with them when they came here. All of those, their worldviews and their culture and the way they did things where they came from. And so the women that came here, had no rights politically. Absolutely nobody was running for office, women back then, or had any votes or anything like that. They had no rights financially. If they got married, the man controlled the purse strings, and they basically became property of the man, as it says in the film. So when you think about that, it makes total sense, that they had to get those ideas from somewhere, and they're living around Indigenous women on Turtle Island who come from cultures where women are highly revered and are on equal footing with the men, politically, socially, economically. They're in control of their bodies, they're in control of their property, they have status with their clan, and actually the clans in our culture, in the Haudenosaunee culture, were matrilineal, and the identity comes through the women, through the clan. So that's passed around through the women's line, which is the opposite of European culture, where everything is going through the man, including property.
Right.
So usually you give property to the men, and for us, it's the women that are the ones that are caretaking for the land and deciding on land.
Right. I loved like the conversation about how future forward the community was at that point in time, in that they were successful, they were peaceful. There was rarely domestic violence, which I'm like, oh, what was that like? Like, when you come into what we know now of today, and the violence that we see against women as it's happened. And it wasn't until literally colonization that the community was set back, essentially, because of the influence of Eurocentric colonization, which is such a sad thing. Like, it was such a peaceful time that could have been an amazing example had it been followed through fully instead of partially to the power of white men.
Yeah, I found it devastating to think about that, because I was, telling the story, we're talking about how Indigenous women empowered the white women to fight for their rights. And at the same time, our rights were being chipped away as women, Indigenous women. And I think that was very purposeful.
Oh, yeah.
If you look in some of the history and some of the things I even talked about in the film, Christianization and, the worldview is being imposed on our people, and boarding schools, and what happened in boarding schools, taking children away from their mothers, and trying to really get rid of who we are, is what, the purpose of those schools were. All of that was happening at the same time. So one's going on the incline and the other was going on the decline at the same time, which is pretty ironic when you think about it.
I mean, that's the level of white supremacist oppression that we have to have a conversation about, that how this has been a beginning conversation, and this has been a thing we've never been able to take the time to get the pattern, because of the continued whitewashing and erasing of true history, which is more beautiful than we know. That's the other part of that, is that there's so many amazing stories that we missed out on because of that, because of all of these outside influences, which was about power and white supremacy and patriarchal nonsense. I'm going to say that, okay. Yeah. But that level, that it erased something so beautiful and pure that could have done so much, and has done for, like, it continues to do, thank goodness, through your community, because you are still upholding it and finding that strength to remember those traditions, which is a beautiful thing. I say this as an adopted person who can't figure out my heritage to save my life. But and when we talk about whitewashing, that's exactly what happened. And it's such a tragic thing to see that is what happened, and that's what we've missed out of my 40-something years of life, not knowing this true history, which we could have been celebrating, because it is an amazing history that we still don't know that much of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And we need this in so many other areas. I mean, this is just one story.
Right. But that's the thing, it's like this one story was huge. It's like this minute detail. I'm having a moment. I've really had like a moment of crisis in discovering your documentary, that is like, this is such a, like, not a minute, it's not minute, but it's a big detail to a big, obviously life-changing thing for so many of us that was left out purposefully so that it couldn't be given credit to where it was due, because we don't want to have anyone get credit outside of those in power. We know this. But the fact that we have missed out for so long on these amazing stories, it just is offensive. And I feel like I have to mourn that, even though I'm also celebrating because we were able to watch it and you have been able to bring it to light to us. And thank you again, fangirling still. But all of that is such a big part of the conversation that we're missing out on. And knowing that in comparison to the other parts of history that we're missing, I don't know that I'm missing out on. I'm sure I have. That's so frustrating. Like, there's so much more that we are missing out on.
Yeah.
Because of the continued whitewashing of these conversations.
Yeah, we need to rewrite history books altogether. I mean, they still look pretty much the same as when I was in school.
Well, we know the new laws that they're trying to pass, especially down here. So Anney and I are in Georgia, so we're down here in the South, and it's an uphill battle to get accurate history. You know, I grew up in a setting that literally told us that the Civil War was fought about state rights. And I'm like, wait, what? What happened? So, you know, when we talk about whitewashing of history, it's still a thing. And again, just talking about how the boarding schools, it really decimated the culture. The purpose of it was to try to kill off a culture that was of the native first people of the Americas. And we know that. But today, again, and I keep harping back on it because I think it's so important that we talk about it, not necessarily here, but in general, the Indian Child Welfare Act was in place to preserve that, because the United States at one point finally were like, oh yeah, that was bad. We literally was doing a genocide for all intended purposes. And maybe we should correct that. And now we're back here again questioning it, because that white supremacist power and ideal is rising back up, is now seemingly, maybe not rising, maybe it just seems like it to me, but it's seemingly coming back into, hey, let's try that again. That didn't work so well last time, we'll try it again.
I think there isn't a Indigenous family that hasn't been affected by boarding schools. I mean, when I was teaching in high school and I would talk about that in class, and we'd, talk about the boarding schools and the history of that, and everybody in their family had somebody that had been affected by boarding school. And it's not just that generation that's affected, it's intergenerational trauma. Right. So it's something that's passed on, and something that was really common in my grandmother's time is they were all fluent speakers at that time. Everybody was a fluent speaker here. And they were prophesizing that there was going to come a time when there's not going to be a lot of language speakers. And at that time, and when my grandmother was alive, it seemed silly. Like they couldn't think of it, that would happen, because there were so many speakers at that time. And that's what's going on now, because my grandmother's generation stopped speaking the language to their children because they didn't want them to be punished when they went to school. And, so they stopped speaking the language to them. And so we feel that now, like in my own family, my grandmother was a fluent speaker. She didn't speak to my mom. My mom didn't speak the language. I learned some language when I was, in the local schools. I had a Mohawk language class for like 40 minutes, and I'm still learning the language. So I can speak somewhat. But my kids went to the Akwesasne Freedom School, and 3 of the 4 are fluent.
That's
And
amazing.
my youngest daughter is teaching adult immersion and is a fluent speaker. She can speak with the elders here, and I'm, really proud of her and all of my kids for their work that they've done and keeping the language going. And that's an ongoing struggle for us to do that.
Right.
And that's a direct result of boarding schools and, a lot of the genocidal practices that have been going on in this country. And it's not just in our community, it's like that all over Turtle Island, and
Right.
some are in much worse shape than we are. Some of them don't have any speakers.
Right. I think we've talked about that before. Like a lot of the languages completely died off because of this and because of the colonization and constant fear of being called out.
Yeah. So it's cool in our community. We do have a lot of language revitalization going on, and it's really important work that we keep the language alive for the future generations.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that Samantha and I both loved about this documentary that I kind of mentioned earlier, was that we kind of saw these like multiple generations of women and kind of this dealing with intergenerational trauma and healing. But seeing that and seeing younger folks in it kind of trying to reclaim traditions and history and culture, or trying to just learn more about it, and seeing that was really, really beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's important that people see how we are like today, because there's still a lot of stereotypes in people's heads of who Indigenous people are. Like we're Hollywood Indians still for a lot of people, or we're not here. A lot of people think that we disappeared, but we're still here. And I wanted to show that, take you into our community for a little bit and see what our youth are like, or what our community is like today.
Yeah, and I think that this was such a great moving way to show that. And I know, like, you're you're a leader in the film community. So do you have anything on the horizon? Any other projects you've got planned that you can talk about?
Yeah, I'm actually in production for 2 films right now. I left teaching back in June last year, so it's been a year now. And I still see all I'm from the community, so I still see a lot of the youth that I used to teach, and I'm still involved in teaching in different ways. But the films that I'm working on now, one of them is a short documentary that will be on PBS probably in 2024. It's called Gahna Uwe, which means original seeds. And it's following Indigenous women seed savers that are protecting and rematriating a lot of our heirloom seeds. And really, the story is like a metaphor for our people. So the same things that these heirloom seeds have gone through, our people have gone through the same things. Like kind of going underground for a while, and then a lot of these varieties are starting to come back up and be revitalized again. Some of the seeds have, gotten disconnected from their people. They've had to relocate, and so it's following the work of these women and the work that they're doing. One of them is Angie Ferguson. She's from Onondaga, and she's been caretaking for a large collection of Indigenous heirloom seeds. So she was given this collection to care for, and she's been actively planting these seeds and giving them out to Indigenous farmers to really keep these seeds going so that they're here for future generations. And she will be rematriating a large collection in the spring back to the Dene people out in the Southwest. So that will be also part of the thing. I'll be also documenting that. And like, I'm just imagining what that's going to be like for them to be able to get those seed relatives back that they haven't seen for a long time, and to, start planting those again and bringing those back. Because with foods, we're so used to, just going to the grocery store and, oh, we have the same kind of tomatoes, and, everything's, there's only a few varieties of things that you see in the grocery store, but there is such diversity and beauty in the seeds. And I've been witnessing that as I've been documenting these ladies. Another one of the ladies is Becky Webster. She's from Oneida, Wisconsin. And, as you know, Oneidas are part of the Haudenosaunee and used to live right next to the Mohawks. There's still some that are there, but a lot of them got relocated out to Wisconsin, and then there's more that went out to London, Ontario. And so it's also documenting the history of what happened to our people along with the seeds. So that'll come out, I think, in 2024. And then I'm also part of a project through Neotero, doing a project for reciprocity. It's a group of filmmakers from around the world that are creating short films. And I think there's 8 of us that are in there making the film. So I'm doing a film here in my community, following a very dynamic woman. Her name's Jessica Shenandoah. And she's been bringing back a lot of our land-based knowledge, like things that we haven't done for a long time, like making fish leather or making mats out of bulrush, or things that we stopped doing because they take a lot of time and people, kind of got disconnected. So she's like bringing a lot of that knowledge back to the community. So I've been documenting her and having a good time doing it too. I'm always amazed by these women.
There's so much history and information, like we were talking about, that's missing. How do you dwindle down what you're going to do? Because it seems like there's a vast amount of things, like that food stuff. That's fascinating. I know Anney, she's actually on another podcast called Savor, and they do history of food, essentially. So
nice.
Anney's probably like, whoa, like, because she's talked to me. I'm putting words in your mouth. I'm so sorry. About the origination of food, like talking about how the fact that has changed so much. Nothing is as it was. So getting to that part, that's amazing.
Yeah, maybe she can have me to talk about that film when it comes out.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a lot of history that is not known about that as well that you don't learn in schools. Like over 60% of the world's foods came from North and South America, from our people. And corn and a lot of the foods that influence the whole world have come from indigenous people. People think potatoes are Irish. Well, they're not. They came from here.
Yeah.
A lot of very important foods have come from indigenous people, and we're trying to, save those so that we have those for future generations. Every community has a relationship with their foods, and there's a lot of foods that are sacred to indigenous people that we need to protect.
Yeah, I would love to have you on to talk about that. But there's just so much history. I think sometimes a lot of us, like you said, just go to the grocery store and I'm like, I want this. And you don't think about how it got to you. And you absolutely should, because it's so important. There's so much history behind it. And I think a lot of the kind of Americanization of food became much more like, how can we breed whatever XYZ to be fast and quick, and then so much was lost that way. Like so much taste was lost that way. So much of the tradition and the kind of just respect for food itself, like how it comes to be and who makes it. And so I just think that's incredibly important.
I think that's one of the main points is that the world that we live in is always pushing us to be fast and quick.
Right.
And with our foods, like even today in our community, we have a strong relationship for our foods, and we have ceremonies for our foods. So in the springtime, when the leaves are really small, we'll have the leaves are just starting to come out. We have ceremony for our seeds, and we sing to our seeds that we're going to plant. So we're letting them know that it's time, it's time we're going to plant them and they're going to grow and that they're going to help sustain the people. And so we have ceremony for these seeds. So we take that time to give them that respect and to honor them in that way. And that's so different than just going to the store and picking something up and, not really kind of being mindless about, what you're consuming. And, we really don't think about, if you're not growing it yourself, where does it come from? What's on it? Are people putting love into this food that you're putting in your mouth? And it seems like we've become disconnected from that, and we need to reconnect. And that's one of the reasons, why I'm making that film, is because I think it's so important that we reconnect to our relatives. It's not just about humans. We're related to everything that's on the earth, and we need to pick those relationships back up if we're going to have something in the future for our great grandkids. We want to have water for them. We want to have food for them. And if we need to build those relationships in order to do that.
And it comes back to every time we talk about climate change, every time we talk about land preservation or trying to just survival in general, is always Indigenous people who are at the forefront in these battles. And they're the first ones who tell us, this is about to go bad. We're about to be screwed. Please listen.
What happens with Indigenous people that are protecting the earth is they kind of get demonized in the media. So people got to think about that when they're seeing this in the media. Those are the people that are trying to protect our earth for the future generations. And, you know, the biodiversity, you know, around the world, 80% of biodiversity is protected by Indigenous people.
Yeah.
That's astounding when you think about it.
It's shocking.
So I think if you want the earth to be protected, give more land back to the Indigenous people.
Right.
And they'll protect it.
Hey, I'm down for it. Let's do this. But, you know, I had to ask the question and then I got sidetracked because the food stuff was so amazing. And I'm excited about this. But how do you dwindle down to be like, okay, this is what I'm going to do my film on this time? Because there's so much, like I said, untapped history that you're digging into. How do you decide on those?
It calls me. So whatever the story that's meant to come through me will call me, and I'll know it. It'll tug at me. So I have to do it. That's how I know.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I know this is going to be one of those, like, tell me, because I need to know, because you do have these connections when you have these films, like The Beauty. We only watched clips of Under the Husk, and like it's a connection. You trying to delve into the fact that you're going back to the heritage and your children and then the generations to come and digging back and holding on to that heritage to, Without a Whisper, talking about the actual history of it and how strong the tribal women were and the matriarch is in this community. What is that feeling? Is it just, yes, I got to tell this story, or is it just, because you have a connection that it makes these films?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm an artist, so besides doing filmmaking, I'm also a visual artist, and it feels the same to me. Like when I'm making pottery, I do pottery as well. I have this idea that starts, and it just wants to come through. So I just work on it until it comes through. So it's the same with these stories, and it'll be something that I'll see different things, and it's, I don't know. I guess I'm guided to do these. That's a better way to put it. Yeah.
And it's gorgeous. So I saw your pottery too. They're gorgeous.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just me. These messages are coming from the ancestors. You know, I think about my ancestors and the things that they were not able to do because they were so oppressed, you know, and they were going through so many, you know, different traumas throughout history. And we're at a time right now where we can do this. We have the time, we have the resources to be able to tell these stories, and we need to do it.
Right. And it's beautiful, I will say. What are some of the things that you would say to future filmmakers who want to share stories in their voices? What would be some advice that you would give to them?
I think it's important to have good allies in filmmaking too. And like for me as a filmmaker in this community of Akwesasne, there's not a lot of filmmakers here. And so in order for me to learn more, I have to reach out to other communities, to other cities, do a lot of networking. You know, I've been fortunate with my films. I've been connected with Vision Maker Media, and they've funded my last 3 films. And I've made a lot of connections through them. Also through my distributor, Women Make Movies. They've done a good job of distributing my films and, you know, connecting me to doing screenings and, you know, to film festivals and different things like that. So all of those things, it's important to connect with other people that are in the industry, but always to remain true to your voice. You know, that's one thing that can be a challenge sometimes, you know, as a kind of an isolated filmmaker is sometimes you'll get other people, you know, trying to change the story you're trying to tell. So you always got to go back to that and to, you know, remain true to your own story. That's why I like to be the director producer, because I don't like anybody bossing me around.
Yes. I love it. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us. Obviously, we're big fans of yours, and we'll be watching what you do. Can you tell the listeners where they can find your work and where they can connect with you?
Sure. So Women Make Movies distributes my films, so you can look them up. I also have a webpage. It's called turoproductions.org. It's just has, a bio and some of the films I've been involved with lately. So yeah, check me out.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we found your documentary on PBS. So if anybody wants to look that up, it is available there, and it's a must watch for all of our listeners.
Yeah, try to get these films in the classrooms. That's where I really want to see them. So if you're a teacher listening out there, you can order them for your school.
Yes.
Through Women Make Movies.
Yes, do that. Well, thank you again for being here. Hopefully we'll have you back again one day, because this was a delight.
Please come back on. Often.
Yes. And listeners, if you would like to reach out to us, you can. Our email is stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter @MomStuffPodcast or on Instagram @StuffMomNeverToldYou. Thanks as always to our super producer, Christina.
Thank you, Christina.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff Mom Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.